Dear friends and colleagues, welcome again to our keynote lecture. As I observed in the Zoom, Dan Michman is also here in the virtual universe of the workshop, and this is a nice opportunity to say thank to Dan Michman because he was so great to take part in the evaluation process of your papers, and helped us to select the best papers for this conference. So thank you very much, Dan. And now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Natalia Aleksiun. Natalia Aleksiun is professor of modern Jewish history at Thoreau College, Graduate School of Jewish Studies, New York. And she will be officially the inaugural Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies in Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida in the spring 2022 semester, as I learned in the website of the University of Florida. Congratulations. Natalia is an old friend of our institute. She took part at our very early conferences and workshops, as for example, before the Holocaust had its name, early confrontations of the Nazi mass murder of the Jews. And she was also a YWI fellow in the second beautiful class between 2013 and 2014. She has published widely on the social, political, and cultural history of Eastern European and Polish Jewry and the Holocaust. And in addition to her conscious history, Polish Jewish historians before the Holocaust, she is the author of Dokad dalej, Ruch Zionistowski w Polsce, 1944-1950. I have to polish my Polish. She published a critical edition of Gershon Taffer's Zaglada Żydów, of Poland, studies in Polish Jewry, as well as and European Holocaust studies, places and spaces and voids in the Holocaust. She serves as a co-editor of Eastern European Jewish Affairs as well. So Natalia, it's beautiful to have you here, so the floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
I prepared some also for you.
So now I undress. It's a strange feeling still. Thank you so much, Eva, and thank you for inviting me. It's truly an honor. And just this first day of the workshop was such a intellectually stimulating and inspiring treat. And I kept on thinking, all these themes that came up in the papers that we heard together today: life stories, post-war, cross-archival approach, gender, larger framework of voices, marginalized experiences, case matching, microhistories, and silences. And all these are very important for my work and for this particular story that I want to share with you, and then we can take it to the broader discussion. Did I already? Nothing moves. Fajga Ginsburg survived the Holocaust with the help of Tadeusz Kobyłko, a Polish man who sheltered her in his apartment in Lwów, today Lviv, in Ukraine. Offered a chance to live under the guise of being Tadeusz's Catholic wife, she became romantically involved with him. She gave birth to Tadeusz's son, who was baptized and recorded by the local Catholic priest under the name Adam Kobyłko. Here's the father. After the liberation of Lwów in August 1944, the Kobyłkos registered as a married couple and later moved together to Bytom in the formerly German part of Silesia that became Polish. Yet in August 1946, Only a year after their arrival in Bytom and in the immediate aftermath of the Kielce pogrom in July 1946, this Jewish woman left her Polish Catholic husband, taking along 2 young children. So she took along 2 young children, the couple's son and her niece, Ita Keller, whom Kobyłko had also rescued and cared for during the war. Here you see the girl and her mother, and likely her grandmother. For several months after, during her travels across Europe, Fyga continued to correspond with her estranged husband in Poland. In the fall of 1947, Fyga and the children arrived in Palestine, where she reunited with family members. Fyga and Tadeusz never saw each other again. Why did Fyga leave Tadeusz and Poland? A closer reading of Fyga and Tadeusz's letters reveals a complex emotional fabric to their marriage or relationship. I don't think they were legally married, which is likely to have begun. Okay, so back to my question. Why did Fyga leave Tadeusz and Poland? A closer reading of Fyga and Tadeusz's letters reveals a complex emotional fabric to their relationship that likely began as a pragmatic relationship under the German occupation. In confronting their separation and the increasing realization of its finality, the couple sought to make sense of their intimate feelings and their parting of ways after the war. Here we have post-war lives. Fyga had to come to terms with the deep bonds that emerged during her struggle for survival, particularly with her complex dependencies on her quote-unquote Aryan husband during the Holocaust. In the early post-war months and years, Fyga's and other such relationships were negotiated, some were reconstituted, while others came to an end. In many survivors' testimonies, we find intimate recollections concerning relationships that they had forged during the war. However, some of these testimonies only reveal traces of such narratives and often employ strategically placed tropes in their discussion of wartime bonds, especially with regards to sexual barter, pragmatic relationships, and romantic bonds with non-Jews. Here are the silences, I think. Survivors were reluctant to reveal extensive details of these sexual and emotional arrangements, which served as strategic when they struggled to hide or pass as non-Jews. And there is a question to what extent these silences can be filled in with family archives that we talked about earlier. In the case of Fyga and Tadeusz, there is in fact ample documentation in the form of Fyga's collection of letters written to Tadeusz, and I don't want to risk showing you a slide. This correspondence, spanning from fall 1946 until late 1947, relates Fyga's life in transit and in transition. She's physically moving across Europe, but also emotionally moving away from her husband. In her writings, she explains how she felt towards him and reflects on what had transpired between them. She reflects upon their experiences during the Holocaust in a very veiled way, only sometimes alluding to her hiding, her dependency on her husband, and their incompatibility, which she overlooked while her life was under threat. In addition to her letters, there are also copies of Tadeusz's official correspondence. Again, I would show you a picture, but let's not. With various institutions and organizations in Poland and abroad, as he sought to tell his side of the story and to mobilize their help in finding his Jewish wife and children. In addition, we have a mediated voice, a memoir composed many years later by Ita Keller, Fajga's niece and Kobyłko's once adopted daughter during the war, giving us some insight into Fajga's life and into Fajga's long post-war silence. For many years after Fajga's departure, between 46 and 73, Kobyłko corresponded with Jewish and non-Jewish institutions, describing his role in her rescue. He was determined to gain their support and to encourage them to intervene on his behalf, both in Poland and in Israel. At first, he simply hoped to locate his wife. Later, he sought to gain moral support and recognition and also protection against anti-Semitism. He felt he suffered as a sort of Jew by association. People remembered him having a Jewish wife, therefore he was Jewish, and so was his new family. These letters show us how carefully he curated the tale of what had happened between him and Fajga. Moreover, they're also witness to his understanding and somewhat warped perception of Jewish power and influence in Poland and abroad. In the 1970s, Kobyłko also documented his wartime story in letters to the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, which were subsequently used in proceedings on his behalf as records that proved his assistance, and he received posthumously title and recognition as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, given by Yad Vashem in 1993, so many years after he passed away. This was on the initiative of Ita Keller. Today I want to focus on Fajga and Tadeusz's relationship and its far-reaching emotional consequences as their lives remained intertwined long after Poland's liberation. By investigating the afterlife of their wartime relationship, which includes their marriage in Lvov under Soviet rule and their life together in Bytom, their experience offers an intimate lens into how Jewish survivors navigated their precarious choices moving forward and the emotional price of their decisions and how these voices resonated in different archives. Indeed, this close reading of their relationship is ultimately tied to the archival holdings of documents created by the survivor and her rescuer. So there is Ita Keller Ben Chaim collection at the USHMM. Again, slide. The archive of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and there is the righteous file at Yad Vashem, that is the file of the proceedings on Tadeusz's behalf. In her close reading of survivor interviews conducted in Lithuania, Israel, and the United States, Hanna Pauline Galai found striking differences that she credited to what she calls the ecologies of witnessing, that is the shaping effect of each country's ambient post-war politics, social myths, regard for Jews, and other cultural influences on how individuals framed their personal experiences. Considering this, I want to turn Pauline Galai's question onto the documents themselves and their archival entanglements and ask what role did it play in the ecology of witnessing. And I'll come back to this question at the end. In his writings, Tadeusz stressed his positive attitude toward Jews in general and his heroic efforts in rescuing Fajga and Ita. His account followed the convention as many other applicants for the title of the righteous among the nations, although he was not formally applying for the title, as many applicants did by focusing on rescue, sacrifice, and martyrdom. In general, they were unlikely to discuss any wartime arrangements that may have hurt their chances for recognition. For example, if the rescue was of one's own Jewish family, or if it was arranged through sexual coercion or payment in exchange for help. Anna Haikova and most recently Katya Gusarov, in her excellent article, Sexual Barter and Jewish Women's Efforts to Save Their Lives, actually shows very well how these files reflect that curating of the stories. On the other hand, the collection at the USHMM and the material at the Jewish Historical Institute points more explicitly to the friction, resentment, and outspoken aspects of this rational relationship and is much more focused on the Jewish agency in the story. Tadeusz Kobyłka and Fyga Ginsburg were, so to say, not a very likely couple. Again, a slide. She was raised in a traditional Jewish family and probably attended a religious Bnos Yaakov school for Jewish girls, which belonged to a network of new institutions devoted to strengthening of the religious commitment of young Jewish women. Before the war, she was a member of a Zionist youth movement, preparing to emigrate to Palestine and about to get married, so life interrupted. In her registration card, issued by the local Jewish committee in Bytom, Fyga only gave basic information about her background and the circumstances of her survival, as many Polish Jews who registered in Jewish committees in post-war Poland did. She stated that she was born in 1913 in Rymanów, to Rivka and Salomon, and that she survived in Lwów with Aryan papers, so no information about Tadeusz and no information about giving birth to her rescuer's son. Tadeusz was a native of Lwów, also born in 1913. Unfortunately, the available documents, especially his own testimonies, do not allow for a reconstruction of his social background or early biography. Kobyłka lived in Lwów and under the Soviet occupation worked at the chocolate factory Hazet, formerly a Jewish company, where he befriended many Jewish workers. In fact, he says he was the only non-Jewish worker there. At some point in March 1942 or earlier, Kobyłka met Fyga Ginsburg. His righteous file and the collection of the documents at USHMM give several accounts of this first encounter, and the multiplicity of these accounts, I think, is quite telling. In one of his post-war letters to the Israeli legation in Poland, he reported vaguely that they lived together shortly after he had helped her escape, quote, on the way to the camp, which would suggest she jumped from the deportation train. In a later account, however, Kobyłka described the story differently, I quote, "In order to save one life, I persuaded the above-mentioned Jewess," he uses that word in Polish, I know it sounds rather awkward, "not to seek rescue in suicide, and I proposed that she return to Lwów, where she would live as an Aryan with me as my supposed wife, hiding under the name of Maria Kobyłka." While his family and friends knew nothing of Fyga, Tadeusz began to live as a married man, having been provided with a marriage certificate by a friendly Catholic priest. In December 1943, Fyga delivered their child at home with Tadeusz's assistance. Kobyłka explained that, quote, "As a result of cohabitation, a baby boy was born who, with the consent of both parents, was baptized in the Roman Catholic Church and was registered there as a legal child based on a fake marriage certificate." Quote, "If we are to trust his dates, Fyga gave birth to their son about 9 months after her departure from Stary Sambor. It is therefore very likely that Adam was indeed Kobyłka's biological son," he goes back and forth about it, "and that their relationship began to mirror the story that he had provided initially to explain Fyga's presence in his apartment." A few months after Fyga had arrived in Lwów, when she was already then pregnant, together with Tadeusz, and began her life as his Catholic wife, he set out to Stary Sambor on an additional rescue mission. Fyga's sister, Salka Keller, again I would like to show you her picture, had hidden her young daughter Ita in a basement during the forced deportation of all remaining Jews to nearby Sambor. Yeah, but I'm afraid this will stop us. So this is just me dealing with the disappointment. Tadeusz carried the child in his arms, escaping on foot from Stary Sambor, and transported the toddler to Lvov. He noted that Ita, who spoke in, quote, the Jewish jargon, meaning Yiddish, had to be dragged with sleeping pills during their escape. Kobyłko concluded, in this way, I became the stepfather of a child who took on the name of Irena Kobyłko. In addition to Fyga and Ita, he also helped other Jews by giving them shelter, providing food and clothing, false documents, and personally accompanying them to safety. His apartment became a hub for Jews who escaped from the ghetto or Janowska camp and sought temporary refuge. And he writes, given my wife's background, my apartment was known as the safest point in the first stage of every escape, where plans for helping various groups and Jewish individuals were thought out. They survived under very difficult conditions until July 44, when the Red Army arrived in Lviv, Lemberg. The family continued to live together after the war, and they registered as a married couple with the annotation that they had lived in an official marriage since 1941, using Fyga's false wartime identity. In his testimony, Tadeusz explained that he could not share the information about being, quote, connected with people of Jewish descent because anti-Semitism was very strong in our country then. Thus, Fyga chose to continue using her name as her legal name for the rest of her life, meaning her Catholic name. According to Kobyłko, they moreover decided, quote, to raise the children in a Polish spirit, which he understands as Catholic. They were never to find out about their Jewish descent, he writes. In September 1945, the Kobyłkos arrived in Bytom in the so-called repatriation wave of Polish citizens moving west from the territories that had become part of the Soviet Union. Tadeusz began working in a coal mine while Fyga cared for the children, but the family struggled and suffered from, quote, psychological exhaustion, this is his words, following their wartime ordeal. They therefore decided to seek assistance, and so Kobyłko agreed to his wife and adopted daughter to register with the local Jewish committee. His son Adam, however, was not mentioned in this registration. Tadeusz also wrote to the Rabbinical Council in Tel Aviv to notify Fyga's sister Rachela, who had emigrated there in 1936 and married Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Edelstein, about her sister's survival. Rabbi Edelstein sent another rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda Aleksiun, on a mission. Aleksiun was traveling in Poland and went through Katowice and Bytom as a member of a rescue delegation of rabbis who had traveled to Europe from Palestine in 1946 with the mission of locating Jewish child survivors. A story to its own right. Kobyłko remembered that upon learning of Fyga's marriage to a non-Jew and raising a child with him, Rabbi Aleksiun expressed indignation and informed her family in Palestine about the disquieting situation. Because of their renewed contact with the Jewish community, the Kobyłkos were now approached with various propositions concerning also Ita Keller's future. Kobyłko received visits and was offered money for transferring Ita to a Jewish orphanage. And in fact, in the summer of 1946, he brought the girl to the Jewish community and she was placed in a Jewish orphanage, and he received payment And he also explained that this was due to difficult material situation. He had no resources to support the child, and her parents were no longer alive. At the time, Tadeusz believed that the Jewish organizations were preparing the Kobyłko family's emigration together from Poland. Instead, he was left on his own when Fajga and the two children left. Kobyłko continued to believe that their separation was only temporary. But Fajga rejected the idea of living together with Tadeusz abroad in general and in Palestine in particular. He received his last message from his wife via the Jewish Agency for Palestine in December 1947. While Fajga and the children settled in Israel, Kobyłko went on to marry a woman named Maria Słota and to raise a new family in Bytom. Now, let me look closely at two aspects central to Tadeusz and Fajga's correspondence: the fate of their son and their incompatibility as a couple. In his various letters to official Jewish and non-Jewish institutions, Kobyłko contrasted his merits of selfless assistance to Jews with an emerging attitude that he had been misled by them collectively. What upset him the most, however, was the loss of his son. Not only was Adam taken away from his father permanently, he had been also, quote, made into a Jew, under pressure from Jewish organizations, as he saw it. Defiantly, Tadeusz composed several accounts of his rescue efforts under the German occupation and his marital crisis after the war, but he obscured the precise nature of his relationship with Fajga and the identity of his son's mother, meaning in the documents it sometimes seems like Fajga actually left with his son, that this was not her son as well, or that she was pregnant when they met. It's really not made clear in the many, many documents that he produced. Generally speaking, Tadeusz's official accounts presented Fajga as a frightened, weak, and utterly dependent on his resources, courage, and initiative, as a passive object in need of his help. Really, all these sentences that he writes about her are in passive voice. Notably, he stressed that his wartime partner had no intention of returning to her Jewish identity after the war, since after liberation, she was, quote, in a process of assimilation. She showed no inclination to dissolve herself to disclose herself to the surrounding Jewish community, but rather she pressed for legalizing the union in the registry office in Lwów. But these are his words, not hers. During the war, Fajga depended on Tadeusz for survival, but now the power relations were reversed and the patriarchal order was threatened. Just the very fact that the family turned to Jewish organizations for help, this is what was going to help them, even in his mind. He seemed to ignore her repeated statements about the decision she made independently. He repeatedly complained that after the war, the local Jewish community, Jewish organizations, and Jewish individuals took a keen interest in his wife, his son, and adopted daughter. He claimed that it was Jews who convinced Fajga to, quote, escape with the children and who promised her assistance. Quote, the very fact that a poor woman without any material means decided to set out for such a long and burdensome journey with two small children bears witness to the fact that my family's emigration was financed and morally supported by some hidden powers in Jewish society, end of quote. Kobyłko accused the Jews and their, quote, hidden international power of relentlessly pursuing the destruction of his mixed marriage. Again, his words, thereby separating the spouse and as a result, obtaining two children for the Jewish community. His understanding of what transpired was not without historical and social context, of course. For many relatives of child survivors and for Jewish organizations, reclaiming children was vital for the sake of the Jewish people, especially following the losses suffered during the Holocaust. As part of this powerful Jewish conspiracy, as it were, Kobyłko claimed, Rabbi Aleksiun had pressured Fyga to have the baptized Adam circumcised before arriving in Palestine. In this matter, he says, my position as a child's caretaker, father, and educator was utterly ignored. Much of Tadeusz's indignation stemmed from his helplessness in the face of the situation, namely the pressure his wife had endured and her own ambivalent feelings towards him. Ultimately, he lacked the language that avoided mobilizing notions of a Jewish conspiracy. Throughout the period of their correspondence, Tadeusz came to believe that even the letters Fyga had sent to him from Europe, and the last letter from Palestine, in addition to those sent later from Israel and Palestine and then Israel, were part of an elaborate plan to prevent him from chasing after his family. Read from Fyga's perspective, however, they are evidence of her emotional turmoil. With few outlets for her painful past and fear about what may come next, letter writing provided a platform to reflect on her choices. In contrast to the official and at times very angry writings of Tadeusz, her letters reveal a drastically different side to the story. Her heart-wrenching letters suggest that Fyga struggled with her decision to leave Poland. She tried desperately to reason with herself and with him, re-evaluating and explaining her decision and looking back on their difficult liaison. Fyga explained to Tadeusz her reasons for leaving Poland. She did not know how to make a living, and she was afraid of poverty. Fyga insisted that she did not care about Tadeusz not being Jewish and that it played no role in their separation. For me, she wrote, you could have been a Hindu. The rest of the formalities without importance. We do not need any legal formalities to dissolve our marriage, neither a priest nor a rabbi. It is our moral issue, purely personal, end of quote. She discussed Adam's circumcision, which was clearly tied to her decision to leave Poland and not to return. When she talked about it with her brother, who survived in France, she noted in one of her letters he recommended circumcision on health grounds, but suggested that, quote, it made no sense if she were to return to Poland. Once she had made the final decision to go to Palestine, she knew it would have to take place. Repeatedly, Fyga alluded to her age, and here we go to changing one's date of birth. Often I am angry, she writes, at the fate that put me in your life. I would not taunt you today, and you would be happier. I see very clearly that I'm not the appropriate wife for you because I look 10 years older than you. And in a couple of years, I will look like an old lady and you will be a man in his prime. And then what would you need an old woman for? Even in Bytom, you felt awkward going out with me because I looked so grim. These contradictions speak to Fyga's fraught position in this relationship and the trauma she had experienced. In a letter written in January 1947, one of her last, Fyga stressed her husband's abusive behavior that may have put her in danger under the occupation. You know well that when I repeatedly heard "get out" and took my coat in order to leave and never come back, I saw before my eyes the child through which I was tied to you strongly, and only because of that child did I accept this treatment. Even in France, when I was at crossroads, where the heart told me to return, the logic said, stay where you are. Fyga was quick to remind him that he treated her, quote, worse than a maid, and that she had no more energy to cry. She asked him to imagine how he would have responded to a new life in Palestine without the knowledge of the language, customs, and conditions, performing hard physical labor in the unsuitable climate. My nerves are so broken already that I could not bear more nagging after working all day. Surely she believed they would have divorced anyway, like many other couples in Palestine did due to the difficult living conditions. She pleaded with him, if you still have some sentiment for me, tell yourself that it is what it is how it has to be. You will eventually bury the past and see that you will be happy. You will get remarried and then we can be good friends. But you're stubborn and vengeful. You will start using lawyers, and in this case, I will not speak a word to you. And then she admitted that she actually only lied to him about her age, that she was, in fact, older. She promised her gratitude if Tadeusz left her and the child, his biological child, alone. In one of her last letters, written in July 1947, on the eve of her departure from Marseille to Palestine, Fyga sought again to reason with Tadeusz. Please, try to understand, she writes, try to understand me, at least now, because if you understood me, you would not have treated me the way you did. I wanted to be everything to you, but I was nothing. Can you try to comprehend how a woman feels when she's at her husband's mercy? In her last letter, penned in December 1947, she makes a direct reference to Tadeusz's role during the Holocaust. She concludes, you gave me a lot, you gave me a life, but if you loved me, this was only natural. I was a sincerely devoted wife to you. I did not betray you, even in my thoughts. Notably, she signed this final communication using only her Jewish name, Fyga. In the letters, she goes back and forth between the Christian Polish name, Maria, and the Jewish name, Fyga. The correspondence between Fyga and Tadeusz reflects the emotional turmoil in the aftermath of the Holocaust, when survivors faced questions about their immediate future, rebuilding their personal and communal lives while coming to terms with the scale of loss, seeking relatives and justice, and reclaiming property. It reveals how people who hid others and those who were hidden carried on, what life decisions they made, and what the repercussions were. The documents discussed reveal two very different sides of this relationship. The contrast between Fyga and Tadeusz's interpretations, voices of what transpired between them during the war and in its aftermath reflects their intended audiences. Fyga wrote intimate letters meant for her husband's eyes only, while Tadeusz's letters appealed to a number of agencies, Jewish and Polish, and thus adopted a more official format. Fyga's account reflects the emotional trauma of Jewish survivors in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Yet it is not difficult to understand Tadeusz's anger as he turned against the Jews whilst fighting for his wife and children. His account outlines the pressures that post-war Jewish organizations exerted on Jews emerging from hiding, which has not been discussed at length in academic discourse. It emphasizes the tension some Jews felt during this period, between being torn between obligations to the rescuer or spouse and an expectation of returning to the Jewish community. Ultimately, Tadeusz did not dwell on the struggles that Fyga and other Jewish survivors faced. However, he understood the threat of post-war anti-Semitism, which not only affected Jews, but also those who helped them. While the exchange of letters between Fyga and Tadeusz is both rich and uniquely explicit, many more testimonies indicate that other Jewish men and women faced similar complex decisions after the war. Should they have stayed in the relationships which had been based on shared traumatic experiences and fortified by a sense of dependency and gratitude to the people who played a crucial role in their survival? These unions often defied pre-war class divisions as well as religious and cultural norms in Jewish and non-Jewish communities. Although the exchange of letters between Fajga and Tadeusz is rich and full of understatements, it refutes the stereotypes also of this self-conscious Jew and also of agency, as the picture of the agency is very nuanced in both what he and what she writes. Both sets of documents really ask us to expand our understanding of relationships during the Holocaust and in the aftermath. Now, back to ecology of testifying. I have recently been going through a collection of applications for assistance that were submitted to the Center Jewish Committee in Poland, an organization representing survivors in the 5 years after the war. And these are fantastic sources of individuals writing and stating what they did during the war and asking for some money or shoes or coat or medications. And as I was going through the scans, I suddenly saw the name Tadeusz Kobyłko. And so I realized that there is more to that than these three archival contexts. The context of the righteous file, which obviously gears you towards thinking about this relationship as a story of a rescue, going beyond the collection that Ita Keller submitted to the USHMM as a kind of collection of a family history, as it includes all these fantastic family pictures that were in the PowerPoint, and the Jewish Historical Institute file that I had seen before, that the story is also scattered out of the frame of one file, that this story also belongs to broader pictures, broader questions of post-war voices. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Natalia, for this really touchy and inspiring lecture for us. I actually have many questions, or I was just thinking about how we could frame this beautiful source, or many sources you just presented us, and you used a very unusual way of telling, which is also, so for me it was excellent because it's extremely complicated to work with these sources. So how can we deal as a historian, as me as a sociologist, you as cultural historians, etc. So how can we deal with these sources which were produced from the same person on the one hand, but on the other we see it a very opaque picture of institutions behind these ego documents and family histories. And how can we establish a family history about this broken family? Can we merge this? So can we understand this controversy between Fajga and Tadeusz as a family biography, so a collective biography, is rather a kind of struggling for recognition, a kind of reconciliation of suffering in the position of Fajga, I guess. And many other questions I have. But now I would like to open the floor for your questions here in the room. And I just want to ask Sandro whether he's there in the Zoom. Oh, are you here? Okay, sorry. So how can we follow now the Zoom questions? Can you help us?
I can help you.
All right, great. No, wonderful. So first we will make a round here from the room and the second round from the Zoom. Okay?
And if I can just, because now I don't worry about stalling. I just, if I can show you.
Please show the pictures. Great idea. Sandro can help you.
I have 2 PhDs, but it doesn't seem.
No, it doesn't. It's not a PhD question. So, who wants to be the first? Okay, so the first is Michal, and then you.
Okay, should I start? Or?
Yes, please start.
Okay, thank you so much for the fascinating talk, as expected, as always. And I was just wondering, I was struck by your statement that Tadeusz lacked language avoiding notions of Jewish conspiracy or something like that. And I was just thinking whether his rendering of the departure of the children to Palestine, whether this can be also related to early post-war discourses about children more broadly, not just about in the language of anti-Semitism, but also, children as the property of the nation, the repatriation of children, something that was, I think, on the mind of Polish nationalists and Polish government as much as the Czechoslovak one, as much as this of Jewish activists. And there's quite a lot of research by Tara Zara and others. So I was wondering if you can trace the language to this as well.
Yes, can I? Thank you, Michal, so much. Precisely. This is one of the aspects of the multiple performances that are happening especially I think in Tadeusz's, in both of their correspondences. Because he writes to communist institutions. He writes to the Polish state radio. He writes to the embassy in Israel. He writes to ministries. And so he doesn't frame it as a Catholic child has been taken and circumcised. He frames it as the Polish nation lost a citizen. So he has this incredible mixing citizenship, body politics of a nation and religious right? Because theoretically, the fact that the child was circumcised, he could have been still a Polish citizen. But for him, this is how he plays this vis-a-vis the authorities, or this is how he presents it, because he thinks that this will mobilize, I think, assistance. And so I think that you're very right, that there is this broader discourse of children, the future of the nations that are rebuilding themselves. And the Polish nation needs that child, and here the Jews got 2 children out of that rescue story. But thank you for reminding us of. Let me just quickly show you. So this is the picture of Fajga with the 2 children on the ship to Palestine, which she sent. Tadeusz, which you still saw. The family archive that is really the file at USHMM, where you can had glimpses of that family on the edge of destruction, just before the war. Ita was born in the summer of 1939. Here is, just to give you a taste, personal letters from Ita, from Fajga, I'm sorry, and official copies of official documents sent by Tadeusz. And here Tadeusz in Bytom with 2 children, likely very shortly before their departure, his righteous among the nations. And apropos, we were talking about testimonial objects, right? So this family archive at USHMM. Here is a picture that she sent from France to Poland to the father of this child and her rescuer. And you can see when it was torn off, kochanemu tatusiowi, to the beloved daddy, right? So there is this intimacy that continues, that the breaking of that intimacy takes time and space as she moves on, her registration. And just fascinating, one of the documents that Tadeusz sends off, it's as if he was writing his application for the righteous. He frames it, he uses the Talmudic notion of one life saving the world. Here is the tree of life that could save the world. I mean, it's fascinating how he later on in his life really seeks to document his story as a righteous, with less of the venom of someone who was betrayed and deserted. And again, just pictures of that family. This is Salka, the mother of the girl that was adopted. Family pictures where you can see, this is an Orthodox family with many aunts and sisters who are married to rabbis. And apropos, this is also the question of ethical boundaries of the profession. I actually was for a long time thinking whether I should use full last names or just speak about Fajga and Tadeusz. But since Ita Keller published a memoir and identified everybody, I decided that for the family in Israel for whom this would be the most could be problematic, this has already been out in Hebrew. So my talking about it in English or writing about it is not revealing a secret that was meant to stay secret.
I have two questions, and the first one is simple about Żegota. If Tadeusz somehow knew or was involved or had any relationship with Żegota or any influence.
There's no sign of it. And I don't think that if he was connected, he would have any reason to not reveal it, especially in the 70s. So I think he's one of these individuals that were doing the rescue work unconnected to any institutional frameworks.
So he was planning everything himself without any involvement of others. Yeah. And another thing, it's not like a question, but it's rather provoking you to tell more about the file of Tadeusz. Yes, okay, he received the title "The Righteous Among the Nations" for basically rescuing own children, but at the same time, or relatives, at the same time he baptized them and actually was strongly against that they would return to Judaism. Don't you see here some hidden anti-Semitism and some... Okay, just want you to tell more. Thank you.
It's fascinating how, and again, there is important work done by scholars about complexity of the righteous and the rescue work, right? How, in a way, Yad Vashem expectation of not having any financial benefits, not being connected via family links, all of this kind of strips those files of the elements that are probably there, but people, apropos, how people know how to apply, right? People know what not to write, including those that were rescued. They know that they should not mention payment, even if payments were made. So this is really a unique, I think, case, again, cross-archival reading, in which you can sort of check, say, I check you, Yad Vashem file, and let me see how much more complicated the story is. And And I think that if we're lucky, there are more stories that we can complicate with more and more archival collections available, and kind of build a more complex story, not just of the Holocaust, but also of the post-war. But yes, it's interesting that the proceedings overlooked some elements that were even in the paper submitted for his righteous title. Now, I alluded to silence because what I find particularly interesting is that Ita Keller submitted the file for Tadeusz's righteous after her aunt died. And she writes in her memoir that Fyga never wanted the name to be mentioned, couldn't bear the name being mentioned in her presence, didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to touch it. And only when she passed away, Ita felt that this was now for her the time to have this man recognized who saved her life. So again, what can we read from that silence? And I'm stopping myself from reading into this silence, because for me that screams trauma, that screams sexual abuse, all kinds of things that we know from research, how it then puts victims into the mode of silencing, but maybe not, right? That silence for me is really a big question. Because Fyga didn't write. I mean, at least not that I was able to find anything. And she lived until 1992. So that's why I was so fascinated by the discussions in the previous sessions, because they're all tying together.
So I'm really sorry, but I see that we have 34 more participants at this conference, and I would like to give the voice for this virtual group of participants, and then you will come.
Yeah, first of all, thank you as well from my side, Natalia, for these amazing insights into your research. And we do have questions from the chat, and I probably will just read all of them. It's 3, and then you can pick whichever one you want to answer first. So the first one would be the question, if you have an idea which role document exchange played, like changing identity by using documents, for example, of friends looking similarly for surviving the Shoah, and also in quantitative dimensions, as in the percentage of all survivors. The second one, coming from Dieter Hecht, could you tell us something about Adam's fate? And also how representative this story is for Poland. And then another question from Karl-Heinz Steinle. Did you have the possibility to get other perspectives on this story, maybe from the daughter and the son? Yeah. And there we have another one coming in, sorry. From Michaela Ragam-Blesch. Did you encounter more cases where Jewish women survived in alleged quote-unquote mixed marriages? And was this a gendered survival strategy? Were there cases of Jewish men being rescued by non-Jewish women? And the first question, just as an important add-on, is coming from Christoph Augustinowicz.
Thank you all. Hello, all wonderful colleagues and friends. When they will all sit together and discuss. So these are great questions. The documents, I'm sure that Anna, actually, in your research on Ukraine, I only deal in my work with Eastern Galicia, with Western Ukraine today. This is how I came across the files, by simply looking for material on hiding and passing. And so there are multiple accounts of how matching of false documents and false identities is taking place. And of course, part of it is what's available. And people sometimes have a choice between documents that might be more reliable because, for example, there are real documents of someone who had passed away and they receive a baptismal record of someone, but the date of birth doesn't really make sense, like the person is way too old or way too young. There is also a question in Eastern Galicia, a very important question of what you can do in terms of cultural passing. What is your cultural capital? And some Jews can pass as ethnic Ukrainians if they had Ukrainian nannies, if they had Ukrainian friends. Some, and my sense is that many more that choose to pass as Poles because they are educated in Polish schools. This is a Jewish community that is linguistically quite Polonized already before 1918, and especially the generation born and educated in the Second Polish Republic. So that is also part of the story. You know, can you take a baptismal record of a Ukrainian when you can't speak the language? And people would know by names what is what. So it's a fascinating performative game of sorts. I'm very interested in one day maybe writing something small about performing down your social class. And this is not only the question of Eastern Galicia, of women from upper middle class, often belonging to intelligentsia, educated, who are passing as simple folks, right? And they need to constantly watch how they speak, how they behave, their body language, not to give themselves away as being mismatched for the class that they are pretending to be part of. But great question, and I would be curious, actually, Anna, of what your experience with sources would be about Adam. Yes, this is part of the question of the ethics of the profession. He seems to have had an extremely difficult and tortured life that involved mental illness and difficulty in adapting. This is not a story with a happy end, the way we often see in, in Spielberg archives, when at the end, the children, great-grandchildren come and everybody's successful and wonderful. This is not the story. And in fact, again, for me, another signal is that Ita says that her aunt loved her son very much, but could not hug him. When she tried to hug him, she froze. So this is a very tortured, not just broken, but tortured family. How representative it is, I have no idea. As you might guess, I'm more of a historical social historian. I'm interested in drilling deep. The uniqueness of this case is that we have the kind of sources that we have. I think that this is a much more common story that we would expect, but I can't give you a number. And I don't think it's only a story about women marrying non-Jews and passing as wives and then remaining in these roles or not. There are multiple accounts of men as well. Now the interesting question is here that theoretically you could marry someone as a Jewish woman without letting your quote-unquote Aryan husband know who you are during the war, if you played the role well. If a Jewish man married a Polish or Ukrainian woman, there had to be an understanding because only Jews were circumcised. So there is that gendered aspect of these marriages, but no, I don't think it's only in the direction of women, Jewish women, non-Jewish men. I think I answered, but thank you for great questions.
There are two more questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalia. And actually, my question also related to Adam, so maybe you can't say more about it, but I was also just curious about if you know anything about whether he ever tried to contact the father or anything like this.
I don't.
If you can't answer, it's okay.
I actually meant to admit to my own guilt as a historian. So as I was working through the file, I was fascinated by the story, and then when I was discovering more and more documents, but just in case, I didn't Google the family in Israel, and I think that there was, in a way, for me, this was a process of my own coming to terms with what I'm reading and how to read it, and I did not want to get that outside of the archive voice. And then when I was finally ready, when I transcribed all the letters, it turned out that Ita Keller had just passed away. So don't wait. Don't wait. So all I was able to find was what she wrote and some recordings that she did, because she was one of these late in life witnesses. She had a career as an educator, and when she retired, she started going to schools, meeting, talking about her experience, and also this is how she reconnected with this understanding that there was a man in her life that was responsible for saving her, and that he never was, in fact, recognized. And then she traced Tadeusz's story. As far as I understand, Adam was not making that journey. I'm still hesitant, and I will probably try to contact Ita's children. I'm curious what they might add to this. The yet one more flip side to the story is that the file at Yad Vashem, the righteous file, ends with clippings of German newspapers, because Tadeusz's much younger wife claimed belonging to a German ethnic minority, and they actually moved to Germany. So his grandchildren and children live in Germany, and they were invited to the ceremony of the diploma being handed over. So, any kind of preconceived notions of how clear-cut the divisions and the definitions are. So this case, I think, is very good in making it more gray and more nuanced. But I'm definitely guilty for not picking up the phone and calling Ita, a few years ago when I still could.
Thank you, Natalia, for all this inspiration. I was wondering, I was thinking about somehow your sources, or the two narratives you present, Fyga's and Tadeusz narrative, somehow they display or reflect power relations from the war times. So isn't it often the case that we have this post-war narrative, Jewish survivor testimonies, that really try to reconstruct power relations, the helpless Jewish woman and somehow Polish men with some agency, in order to legitimate their own behaviors during occupation? What do you think about this?
Yes, I wondered about it. And again, thank you for letting me talk even more about Fajga and Tadeusz beyond my allotted time. Thank you. I think that in a way this is an extreme case, because Fajga doesn't give us her post-war narrative given from a place of, let's say, relative safety, emotional safety, right? The way that people record their testimonies in the 90s, that they write something for their grandchildren's projects in high school. Not that this is some kind of a perfect source, but we only hear her voice as she directs her voice at Tadeusz. And I mentioned that he performs his story, but she performs as well, I think. I think that to some extent there is a lot of appeasing, there is a lot of playing into his frustration and anger that, what exactly can he do? Whom exactly can he mobilize to stop her? In 1946-47, it's not like he can place an international police search for his child, but he can make trouble to the for the Jewish community in Bytom where they lived, or for the particular rabbis in the region. So I don't have that thing that Fajga would write in 1970s, right? So she doesn't claim her agency in her letters. She doesn't say, I met you and I decided that this was how I was going to survive. And if I can do it, maybe you can also save my niece. Why not, right? Let's see. While he is, I would say, it's almost over the top. He is like this, this Superman performing acts of bravery daily on his own. At some point he's shooting at some German gendarmes that are approaching the house. He's jumping from the window. He's like an American movie. And we have only that. So in a way, this is an extremely imbalanced kind of lens. But I think that maybe precisely by reading one against the other, you can see cracks in both.
Just a check in the virtual universe. Everything is well answered. Beautiful. Any more questions or comments? Natalia will be here tomorrow as well. So if you cannot sleep, please write your questions. And go. It's a story. Maybe sometimes one cannot sleep with this story.
we can. Well, and I'm looking forward to your stories tomorrow.
Yes,
and
absolutely. So thank you so much. It was really touchy, and I think we have many similar stories in our archives. So just please find them, and see you tomorrow at 9:30. And now you should have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.